If you ever want to see the ugliest side of people you thought you could trust, just add money. 6 weeks ago, I was living a quiet, ordinary life. I taught kindergarten in a small public school, lived in a cozy one-bedroom apartment, and considered myself lucky if I could afford takeout once a week. My biggest concerns were lesson plans, overdue library books, and whether my favorite coffee shop would run out of blueberry muffins before I got there. Then, in a single phone call, everything changed. That call told me my grandparents, the only 2 people who ever truly showed up for me, were gone. And just when I thought my world couldn't fall apart any further, a lawyer handed me the kind of news that flips your stomach and makes your hands shake. They'd left me everything. Not just the old house with the vegetable garden and the lemon-scented kitchen. Not just a few savings bonds tucked away in a drawer. I'm talking about $26 million in cash, investments, and property. And if you think that sounds like a blessing, you've never watched the people who share your blood turn into predators. Because the moment the rest of my family found out, my phone started ringing and it didn't stop. The tone wasn't, "I'm so sorry for your loss." It was, "When can we talk about my share?" What came next was part greed, part betrayal, part psychological warfare. People who hadn't spoken to me in months, sometimes years, suddenly remembered my number. My father, my mother, my brother, even my aunt who lives 3 states away. They all had ideas about how their inheritance should be handled. There's just one problem. It wasn't their inheritance. My grandparents had been crystal clear about who they wanted to have it and why. And that person was me. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you'll hear about the shocking will reading that turned a grieving family gathering into a full-scale war. The manipulation tactics my parents used to try to force me to sign it all away. The secret plan my grandparents set in motion years before they died to protect me when this day inevitably came. And the moment I realized I'd gained more than money. I'd gained a family I never expected. This isn't just a story about money. It's about the ugly truth of entitlement, the price of standing your ground, and the surprising ways real love shows up when it matters most. So buckle up. Because if you've ever wondered what $26 million can do to a family, you're about to find out. Before my grandparents left me $26 million, my life was simple. So simple, in fact, that some people might have called it small. But I liked it that way. I've always believed you can tell a lot about a person by the way they live when no one's watching. And before the money, I was just a 27-year-old kindergarten teacher trying to make ends meet. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from my grandparents' place. The building wasn't fancy. Creaky floors, temperamental plumbing, and neighbors whose cooking smells traveled through the vents, but it was mine. Or at least I thought it was mine. I had thrifted furniture, a small bookshelf that was already overflowing, and more plants than windowsills to put them on. My life revolved around lesson plans, playground duty, and my Sunday dinners with Grandma Elizabeth and Grandpa Harold. And those dinners, they weren't just a tradition. They were a lifeline. See, my parents, Richard and Diane, were always physically present in my life but emotionally absent. My dad worked 60-hour weeks chasing the next corporate promotion. My mom worked just as hard at perfecting her image in the right social circles. Family dinners at our house were rare, and when they happened, my parents were usually on their phones or talking about people I didn't know. They provided the basics: food, shelter, clothes, but warmth, attention, and guidance that came from my grandparents. From the time I was 5, I spent every weekend and summer with them. Their 4-bedroom house on 3 acres was my true home. Grandpa tended a vegetable garden and taught me how to grow tomatoes so sweet you could eat them like apples. Grandma taught me to bake cookies from scratch and sew a missing button in under a minute. They showed up for every school play, every soccer game, every science fair my parents couldn't make because of work or important events. What made their influence so remarkable was that they were wealthy, very wealthy, but they never flaunted it. They started a logistics company in their garage in the 1970s with a single truck and a dream. By the time I was born, Alexander Logistics had grown into a regional powerhouse with a fleet of 200 trucks and 5 warehouses across 3 states. Yet you would never guess their net worth by looking at them. Grandpa drove the same pickup for 20 years. Grandma clipped coupons and waited for sales. Their philosophy was simple. Money is just a tool, not a measurement of your worth. Use it to build something meaningful, not to impress people who don't matter. This belief, ironically, was the exact wedge that drove my father away from them. As their only son, he had grown up expecting to inherit everything and live lavishly. He called them stingy and old-fashioned when they wouldn't buy him luxury cars or fun vacations. They paid for his college education but expected him to work summer jobs. They gave him a down payment for a modest home, not the luxury condo he demanded. And when he asked for an executive position in the company without any relevant experience, they told him he'd have to start at the bottom like everyone else. He stormed out, took a corporate job elsewhere, and their relationship never recovered. With me it was different. They paid for my college in full and told me to follow my passion, not the paycheck. When I said I wanted to teach kindergarten, they were thrilled, even though the salary barely covered my bills. They didn't measure my worth by my bank account, and I didn't measure theirs by what they could give me. That's why I never thought about their wealth. I knew they were comfortable, but I assumed most of it would go to my father, aunt, and other relatives when the time came. I never saw myself as someone who would inherit millions. In fact, if you'd asked me 6 weeks ago, I would have told you I had a pretty good idea of how the future would unfold. I'd keep teaching, maybe move into a slightly bigger place one day, and keep those Sunday dinners alive for as long as possible. Then came the phone call. A drunk driver ran a red light. My grandparents were on their way home from their favorite restaurant. They died instantly. The grief hit me like a wave I couldn't come up from under. The house that had always felt so warm now seemed unbearably empty. I couldn't even bring myself to go inside after the funeral. I stayed in my apartment, took time off from teaching, and tried to process the fact that the two people who had shaped me most were gone. What I didn't know then was that my loss was about to open a door I never saw coming. 2 weeks later, I got a call from their attorney, Matthew Goldstein, asking me and my immediate family to come in for the reading of the will. At that moment, I assumed it would be a formality. Some sentimental items, maybe a little cash for each grandchild, and the bulk of the estate going to my father and aunt. What I walked into instead was the opening scene of a family war. Because in that conference room, surrounded by people who had barely spoken to my grandparents in years, I learned the truth. They had left everything to me. If you've never sat in a room where the air gets so heavy you can feel people's resentment pressing in on you, let me paint the picture. The morning of the will reading was gray and drizzly. Exactly how I felt inside. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a simple black dress and carrying the umbrella Grandma insisted I keep in my car, just in case. The law office was in an old Victorian house downtown, all warm wood paneling and leather chairs. Matthew Goldstein, my grandparents' attorney and longtime friend, greeted me with a gentle handshake. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Natalie," he said, eyes genuinely soft. "Your grandparents were extraordinary people." Before I could answer, the glass door swung open. My family arrived like a small storm front. My father came in first, checking his expensive watch like every second in this room was costing him money. My mother followed, designer handbag on her arm, wearing more perfume than sympathy. Jason, my 25-year-old brother, strolled in with sunglasses indoors and a half-tucked shirt, looking like he'd rolled straight out of bed. Aunt Pam was already on her phone, complaining loudly about some rude woman at her country club. Uncle Steve trailed behind like a ghost, barely making eye contact. "Well, let's get this over with," my father announced, skipping pleasantries. We all took our seats around a large oak conference table. My father claimed one end like he was the CEO of this meeting. I chose a seat near Matthew, as far from the others as possible. Matthew adjusted his glasses and began. "Elizabeth and Harold Alexander, being of sound mind." The legal wording went on for a few minutes, my relatives fidgeting impatiently. Then came the moment. "We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including but not limited to all cash assets totaling approximately $8 million, our investment portfolio valued at approximately $12 million, all real estate holdings valued at $5 million, and our 25% ownership stake in Alexander Logistics valued at approximately $1 million, to our beloved granddaughter, Natalie Grace Foster. Silence. I actually stopped breathing. Did I just hear that right? Matthew continued. We specifically and intentionally make no provisions for our son Richard, our daughter-in-law Diane, our grandson Jason, our daughter Pamela, or our son-in-law Stephen, as we have provided for them during our lifetime. The reaction was instant. My father shot to his feet so fast his chair tipped backward. Let me see that, he barked, snatching the will from Matthew's hands. His eyes scanned it, growing more furious by the second. This is ridiculous. My mother's voice joined in, sharp and dripping with disdain. $26 million to a kindergarten teacher. She wouldn't know the first thing about managing that kind of money. Jason slammed his palm on the table. What about me? I'm family too. I've got business ventures. Aunt Pam turned on me, her face blotchy with anger. What did you do? How did you manipulate them into this? I sat frozen, still trying to process the number 26 million and the fact that my grandparents had left all of it to me. Matthew calmly retrieved the will from my father's grip. If you'll all please take your seats. There is more. He pressed a button and a large screen flickered on. Suddenly, there they were. Grandpa Harold and Grandma Elizabeth, sitting side by side on their familiar living room sofa. My heart clenched. If you're watching this, Grandpa began, it means we've passed on. We want to explain our decisions directly, to prevent misunderstandings. Grandma's voice was steady. Richard, Pam, we love you. But we have been deeply disappointed by the values you've embraced. For decades, you've prioritized material wealth over relationships. You've treated us as a resource to be tapped, rather than as parents to be cherished. Natalie is the only one who has consistently demonstrated the values we hold dear. They went on to list examples. Missed events, unpaid loans, dismissive comments about their lifestyle. Grandpa's voice grew firm. Natalie visits us not because she wants something, but because she genuinely cares. She chose a career helping children despite the low pay. We trust her to be a good steward of what we have built. By the time the video ended, the room's atmosphere had shifted from shock to something darker. My father's voice was a low growl. They were senile. We'll contest this will. No judge will uphold it. Matthew's reply was calm but cutting. They anticipated that response. They underwent extensive cognitive testing before finalizing this will. Contesting will be extremely difficult and expensive, and unlikely to succeed. That's when my mother's tone changed, turning sugary sweet. Natalie, darling. You know this isn't right. This money belongs to the family. You'll share it with us, won't you? All eyes turned to me. I mumbled something about needing time to think, and my father immediately seized on it. Good. Come to our house tonight at 6. We'll sort this out as a family. It wasn't a request. As I left the office clutching the thick envelope Matthew had handed me, keys, documents, contact info, I felt the weight of it settle in my lap in the driver's seat. I had just inherited a fortune. But in that moment, all I could think was, I've also just inherited a fight. And my family wasn't going to fight fair. I sat in my car for hours after the will reading, the envelope from Matthew on the passenger seat like a live wire I was afraid to touch. My phone buzzed constantly. Calls, texts, from numbers I didn't want to answer. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady rain, tapping against the windshield in a rhythm that only made my thoughts louder. When the clock crept toward 5:45 p.m., my stomach twisted. I'd promised, or rather been ordered, to come to my parents' house. Every fiber of me wanted to ignore it, but part of me still held on to some fragile hope that we could talk, that maybe this wouldn't get ugly. I pulled into their long driveway, the house looming like a granite and glass monument to status. All the lights in the formal living room blazed. Everyone was already there. My parents, Jason, Aunt Pam, Uncle Steve. I walked in carrying only the envelope, my grandmother's rabbit-shaped keychain peeking from the top. Sit down, my father said, gesturing to a chair that faced all of them. His tone was clipped, the kind of voice he used in business meetings when he'd already decided the outcome. He didn't waste time. Let's be reasonable. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you. My mother leaned forward, her voice syrupy but sharp underneath. Sweetheart, managing wealth is complicated. Your father has the experience to handle this. You can still have a nice portion. Enough for a down payment on a real house instead of that apartment. I stayed quiet, letting them talk, and that was apparently all the encouragement they needed. Here's the proposal, my father said, pulling a typed document from the coffee table. You sign over the estate to me, as financial head of the family. I'll ensure everyone gets their fair share. You'll receive 10%. That's more than generous considering your limited needs. 10%, I said, finally finding my voice. That's over 2 million, Jason piped up. More than enough for a teacher. I need at least 5 million for my new cryptocurrency exchange. It's going to be huge. I bit back a laugh. Jason's last huge idea was an app for rating public restrooms. It burned through $50,000 of my parents' money before collapsing in 3 months. And Pam jumped in next. The house should go to us. We have 3 children to think about. Better schools, safer neighborhood. I almost told her the truth, that her kids had never even visited my grandparents' house. But I stayed quiet. When demands didn't work, they switched tactics. Guilt. After all we've done for you, my mother said, her eyes glistening with fake tears. We gave you life, a good home, opportunities. And this is how you repay family loyalty. Loyalty. I could barely stop myself from laughing. When was the last time either of them had called me just to check in? When had they attended a single school play or game? Then came the threat. We're not asking, Natalie, my father said, his voice low and dangerous. We're telling you. Either you sign the transfer documents voluntarily, or we contest the will. We'll bring up every questionable interaction you had with your grandparents, how often you visited them alone, what you might have said about us when we weren't there. It will get ugly. Something in me shifted then. I remembered my grandfather's words from when I was 8, standing up to a bully on the playground. No one can take your dignity unless you give it away. I looked around the room. My so-called family wasn't talking about my grandparents' wishes. They weren't even pretending this was about honoring them. It was about control, entitlement, and greed. I'm not signing, I said. My voice was calm. Final. The room went still. My father's face tightened. My mother's eyes narrowed. Jason muttered something under his breath. You're making a mistake, my father said, standing now, looming over me. You can take your precious inheritance and consider yourself disowned. You can't have both. It was meant to scare me. And it did, until I realized the truth. I'd never really had their love to begin with. What was there to lose? I'm sorry you feel that way, I said, standing too. But I have to honor what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. His answer was a cold laugh. You live in an apartment we co-signed for because your teacher salary couldn't get you the lease. Guess what? We own that building through one of our companies. Consider your lease terminated. The blood drained from my face. They weren't bluffing. You have 30 minutes to pack essential items, my mother said, looking at her watch. Locks change tomorrow. In a daze, I went to my room and started stuffing clothes, documents, and a few sentimental things into bags. My father stood in the doorway like a guard, making sure I didn't steal anything. My mother was already on the phone with a real estate agent about selling my grandparents' house. Before I left, my father added one last dagger. We were going to divorce before your mother got pregnant. You were the obligation that kept us together. Obligation, not love. When I finally walked out into the night air, 3 bags in hand, I was technically homeless, cut off and alone. But somewhere deep down, beneath the shock, beneath the fear, a new feeling had started to grow. Resolve. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I was going to fight. Not just for the money. For their legacy. The first night after my parents kicked me out, I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, trying to figure out where to go. Hotels needed a credit card I didn't have the limit for. Friends were an option, but how do you explain that scene to someone at nearly midnight? Then I remembered the envelope from Matthew. Inside, beneath stacks of documents, was a set of keys. I recognized the rabbit-shaped keychain immediately. It had hung in my grandparents' kitchen for years. The keys to their house. The drive there took 20 minutes, my headlights cutting through the dark. The porch light was on, probably on a timer my grandfather had set. My hands shook as I unlocked the door. The scent hit me first. Lemon verbena potpourri and the faint polish Grandpa used on Sundays. For a second, I expected to hear them calling from the kitchen. Instead, the silence was heavy. I went to the guest room I'd always stayed in, dropped my bag on the bed, and found the last book I'd been reading still sitting on the nightstand, bookmark in place. My grandmother had left fresh towels folded on the dresser, probably the week before the accident. That undid me. I cried until I fell asleep. By morning, my phone was full of new messages, threats from my father, guilt trips from my mother, and a chilling text from Jason. Enjoying the big empty house? Not for long. I forwarded the text to Matthew. He replied instantly, "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else." When he arrived, he had coffee and a briefcase. "Your family's already talking to lawyers about contesting the will," he said. "I anticipated this. But your grandparents did too. They left me with instructions for this exact situation." He pulled out a property deed. 5 years ago, your grandmother bought a small cottage outside town. It's in a separate trust, in your name only. No one else knows about it. If you need to disappear for a while, you can. Relief washed over me. But hiding wasn't what I wanted. "There's more," Matthew said. "They also left behind something much more powerful than money. They built a network of people who will stand with you." As if on cue, a knock came at the back door. A man in his 50s stood there, hat in hand. "Miss Natalie," he said warmly. "I'm Carlos. I was your grandparents' estate manager and handyman for 15 years. They told me to look after you if anything happened to them." He joined us at the kitchen table and told me something that made my stomach drop. "Right after the funeral, your father and brother came here when no one was around. They took things, watches, jewelry, electronics. But I have it all on the security cameras." I'd forgotten my father had installed a system years ago. But Carlos explained that my grandfather had it replaced last year with one he trusted, one that covered the blind spots. Matthew's eyes lit up. "That footage could be critical if they try to claim you're unfit to manage the estate." Carlos had more. Mrs. Elizabeth kept journals. Detailed ones. She documented everything. Visits, conversations, requests for money. There in her study. I followed him to the small study off the main hall. The shelves were lined with leather-bound journals, each meticulously dated. I opened one at random and saw my grandmother's handwriting. May 15th. "Richard visited today for the first time in 7 months. Immediately pitched a cryptocurrency investment requiring $250,000. When Harold refused, he accused us of preferring Natalie. Said she only visits to secure her inheritance. Could not be more wrong. Natalie has never asked for money, has no idea of our net worth, brings food every Sunday, and stays to eat with us." Every page was like that. Clear, specific records that painted a stark contrast between my interactions with them and my family's. Over the next few hours, more people arrived. Dorothy, the housekeeper of 20 years, who hugged me like family. Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' business partner, who knew every detail of Alexander Logistics and offered to mentor me. George Patel, their investment advisor, who brought complete financial records. Even Sarah Johnson, their neighbor, showed up with a casserole and stories from the neighborhood. Each one had loved my grandparents, and they cared about me because of it. They weren't just here out of obligation. They were here because my grandparents had prepared them for this moment. Dorothy found more evidence while cleaning out my grandmother's desk. A USB drive containing security footage of my mother rifling through Elizabeth's jewelry box during the funeral reception. It was becoming clear. My grandparents had anticipated this exact fight. They hadn't just left me money. They'd left me allies, proof, and a plan. By late afternoon, Matthew leaned back in his chair, a satisfied look on his face. "Natalie, this isn't just about keeping the money. This is about protecting a legacy they spent their lives building. Tomorrow morning your family's coming here. We're going to be ready." For the first time since the will reading, I felt the balance shift. They had their entitlement. I had the truth, and the people to prove it. That night, after everyone left except Carlos, I sat at the kitchen table flipping through my grandmother's journals. Between her careful cursive notes and Matthew's stack of financial records, I started to understand something important. My grandparents had been quietly shaping a legacy for decades, and they'd chosen me not because I was family, but because I got it. The proof wasn't just in the money. It was in the lives they'd already changed. Case Study 1. The Truck Driver's College Fund. One journal entry from 2009 stood out. "Luis came by the office today to thank Harold again. His oldest just started at the university. 4 years full tuition, our gift. Harold says we invest in our people, not just our business. Luis has been with us since the second warehouse opened. Always reliable, always kind. If his children succeed, our community succeeds." I remembered Luis. He was one of Grandpa's drivers. Big smile, always brought fresh donuts to Sunday dinners if he happened to be on a delivery route near the house. I never knew my grandparents had paid for his daughter's college. No fanfare. No public acknowledgement. Just done quietly because it was the right thing to do. It clicked for me then. This wasn't about the size of the fortune. It was about how it was used. Case Study 2. Saving the Park. Rosa Martinez told me a story over coffee that same night. "Do you remember the winter they wanted to sell the land near the river to developers?" she asked. I vaguely remembered protests, but I was still in school back then. "Your grandparents bought the land outright. Paid cash. Then they donated it back to the city under the condition it remained public green space forever. That's why the park is still there today." Harold said, "What good is wealth if you can't use it to protect the things worth keeping?" Park. I'd played there as a child, sitting on the swings while Grandpa pushed me higher, the air filled with the smell of pine and wet leaves. I never knew it still existed because of them. It was another quiet victory they never bragged about. Case Study 3. The Emergency Mortgage Payment. Dorothy's story was the one that broke me. "A few years ago," she said, "one of the cashiers at the grocery store you like, Marcy, the one with the glasses, was about to lose her house. Her husband had left, the bills piled up, and she was 2 weeks from foreclosure. Your grandmother found out while buying lemons. She and Harold went straight to the bank and paid off the mortgage. Marcy cried in the break room for an hour. They never told anyone. Marcy thought the bank made a mistake until your grandmother sent her a card that just said, 'Now you can breathe again.' I sat there with tears stinging my eyes. These weren't just isolated acts of kindness. They were the pattern. Over and over, my grandparents had chosen to use their resources to help quietly, directly, and meaningfully. And now they'd left me in charge of continuing that work." Matthew leaned forward as I shared the journal entries I'd found. "This is why they picked you, Natalie. You never asked for anything. You never treated them like a bank. You valued them for who they were, not what they had. They believed you'd use this money the same way they did." For the first time, I felt a strange confidence replace the knot of fear in my stomach. They hadn't set me up to fail. They'd set me up to succeed. That night, before going to bed, I walked through the house with a different perspective. This wasn't just my inheritance. This was a mission. Trust. Something bigger than my comfort or my bank account. I wasn't just defending myself in the morning. I was defending them. The house was quiet again by the time the clock struck 9 p.m., but my mind wasn't. I sat at the dining table with Matthew, the journals spread out like a paper fortress in front of me. Carlos stood by the doorway, arms crossed, keeping that silent watch he'd promised my grandparents he would. Tomorrow morning they'll come, Matthew said simply, as if announcing the weather. And they'll expect you to be alone, overwhelmed and unprepared. Our job is to make sure they find the opposite. He slid a yellow legal pad toward me. Here's the plan. We're going to make it impossible for them to bully you, and even harder for them to contest the will. We broke it into steps. Step 1. Secure the perimeter. Carlos took this one without hesitation. I'll be at the front door before they arrive. They won't get past me unless you say so, he said. And the cameras are rolling, inside and out. Everything will be recorded, Matthew added. We've already got cloud backups. If they try to remove anything from the property, that's theft. Chief Williams, he paused for effect, is aware of the situation. It was the first time that night I smiled. The idea of my father trying to intimidate a police chief was almost worth looking forward to. Step 2. Reinforce the narrative. Matthew tapped the journals with his pen. These are more than memories, they're evidence. Your grandparents wrote down years of interactions. It's clear, consistent, and paints a pattern of behavior from your family. That, plus the video from the will reading, makes their accusations about manipulation laughable in court. He looked me in the eye. Tomorrow, you're not just a young woman defending herself. You're the voice of Harold and Elizabeth Alexander. Everything you say should circle back to their wishes, not your feelings. Step 3. Assemble the witnesses. I'd assumed tomorrow would just be me, Matthew, and maybe Carlos. I was wrong. They expect to find you cornered, Matthew said. Instead, they'll walk into a room full of people who knew your grandparents, who saw their values in action. Rosa would be there, laptop ready with company records proving unpaid loans and financial support already given to my father and aunt. Dorothy would be there to speak to the years she'd seen my family ignore and disrespect my grandparents. George Patel would bring the investment records, and Sarah Johnson would represent the neighbor's perspective. You're creating a wall, Matthew explained. Not of lawyers, but of truth. That's harder to knock down in the court of public opinion, and they care a lot about that. Step 4. Control the conversation. The biggest risk tomorrow wasn't legal. It was emotional. My family knew how to push my buttons, how to make me doubt myself. You'll be tempted to respond to their insults or accusations, Matthew said. Don't. Keep every statement tied to 2 things: the will and your grandparents' values. If they threaten you, acknowledge it calmly and document it. Carlos added, if anyone raises their voice at you, I'll step between. They won't touch you. Step 5. The legal hammer. Matthew pulled out a thick folder. These, he said, are pre-prepared cease and desist orders for harassment, notices of the items they took from the house, and restraining orders if necessary. If they try to argue tomorrow, you hand them one of these and say, my attorney will be in touch. Flip through them. They were detailed, specific, and, frankly, intimidating. They've gotten away with intimidation because no one's ever called their bluff, Matthew said. Tomorrow we call it. Step 6. Set the emotional tone. Dorothy volunteered for this one, though she didn't call it that. Your grandparents believed in hospitality, she said. If we serve coffee and pastries, it sends a message. You're in control, and you're not lowering yourself to their behavior. It will disarm them more than you think. I pictured my mother's face when she walked in to find me calmly pouring coffee instead of shaking in a corner. It made my chest feel lighter. By the time we finished mapping everything out, it was nearly midnight. My nerves were still there, thick, buzzing, but they were laced with something else. Resolve. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. When I finally went upstairs to the guest room, I noticed the way the house felt different. It wasn't just my grandparents' absence that filled the air now. It was their presence, in the form of every person, every plan, every small detail they'd left behind to make sure I could stand tomorrow. The morning came faster than I expected. By 8 a.m., Matthew was back with fresh coffee and pastries. Dorothy arrived right after, taking over the kitchen like she owned it. Rosa set up her laptop at the dining table. Carlos stationed himself by the front door. The house felt full, but not crowded, fortified. Every person there had a reason to protect this place. And me because they loved the people who built it. By 9:30, the only thing left to do was wait. "They'll be early," Matthew said. "Bullies like to catch you off guard." At 9:45, the first car rolled into the driveway. My father's black sedan. Then my mother's white SUV. Aunt Pam and Uncle Steve's convertible. Jason's ridiculous sports car. "They're here," Carlos said simply. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my sweater, and walked to the center of the living room, exactly where we'd planned. Let them come. If there's one thing Matthew drilled into me the night before, it was this. They'll come at you with emotion. Don't step into their ring. Stay in yours. The mistake most people make in situations like this. They fight on the aggressor's terms, reacting to insults, defending themselves against lies, letting the conversation get personal instead of factual. That's where bullies win. So as Carlos opened the front door at exactly 10 a.m., I stayed rooted in the center of the living room, the journals neatly stacked on the coffee table, my allies positioned just as we'd planned. My father walked in first, scanning the room like he owned it. Behind him, my mother's lips were already pinched in disapproval. Jason had his hands shoved in his pockets, his smirk ready. Aunt Pam muttered something to Uncle Steve that sounded like, "This is going to be easy." Mistake number 1. Underestimating your opponent. They thought I'd be alone. Instead, they were met with Rosa at the dining table, Dorothy in the kitchen, George Patel by the fireplace, and even Judge Henderson, my grandparents' longtime friend, standing quietly near the entryway. The shift in their expressions told me they hadn't prepared for an audience. My mother was the first to speak. "What is all this? Why are there strangers here for a private family discussion?" Mistake number 2. Controlling the framing. If I'd answered her directly, I'd be accepting her premise, that this was family business. Instead, I kept my voice calm. These aren't strangers. They're people who knew and respected Grandma and Grandpa for decades. They're here to ensure their wishes are honored. Judge Henderson added, "And I'm here as an impartial witness, per their written request." My father's voice rose. "We're here to collect what's rightfully ours. Let's not waste time." Mistake number 3. Accepting vague claims. Matthew stepped forward before I could answer. "You'll need to specify exactly what you believe is rightfully yours. Otherwise, this conversation is over." The directness caught him off guard. Jason tried next, flashing that smirk. "You really think you can run a business, manage millions? You'll burn through it in 2 years. Just sign it over now and save yourself the embarrassment." Mistake number 4. Taking the bait. The old me might have defended myself or snapped back. Instead, I said, "That's not relevant to my grandparents' will or their intentions. This isn't about my abilities. It's about their decision." Jason's smirk faltered. Aunt Pam's tactic was different. Emotional guilt. "You've already got the house and the money. We have kids, Natalie. Better schools, safer neighborhood. Think about your cousins." Mistake number 5. Letting guilt rewrite reality. I looked her in the eye. Grandma and Grandpa did think about the kids. That's why they created educational funds and left instructions for scholarships. Those funds will still be available, but not by ignoring their wishes. It was a subtle reminder that I wasn't cutting anyone off from help. I was cutting them off from control. The last trap was the ugliest. My father leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "Sign over control or we go to court. We'll drag your name through the mud. Every time you visited alone, every word you ever said about us. Don't think we won't use it." Mistake number 6. Letting threats dictate your choices. Matthew stepped between us, handing my father a thick envelope. Inside is evidence your parents collected. Financial records, security footage, and documented patterns of your own conduct. If you pursue litigation, this all becomes public record. I strongly suggest you review it before taking that path. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It struck me then how easily I could have fallen into every single trap if I hadn't been prepared. Underestimating them, thinking they'd be rational because we were family. Accepting their framing, letting them define this as family business instead of legal business. Taking the bait, reacting emotionally to Jason's mockery. Absorbing guilt, letting their think of the children plea override the truth. Yielding to threats, believing they had more power than they actually did. But now, each attempt was met with calm, documented facts. Every trap they set, we sidestepped. By the time the conversation ended, they weren't leaving because they'd gotten what they wanted. They were leaving because they knew they couldn't. And that, Matthew whispered to me as the door shut behind them, was exactly what my grandparents had been preparing me for. The house felt quieter after they left. Not empty but cleansed. Dorothy brought in another pot of coffee, and the others stayed for a while, just talking. No strategy. No defense. Just warmth. For the first time since the will reading, I realized something important. My life wasn't going back to the way it was before. This wasn't just about surviving the fight. It was about what came next. Over the weeks that followed, I had choices to make. Big ones. And I made them with my grandparents' voices in my head. Rebuilding the home. The first change was the house itself. For weeks, I still stayed in the guest room, unable to sleep in the master bedroom without feeling like an intruder. Eventually, I moved in not because I wanted the big room, but because I wanted to make it a living space again. With Carlos's help, we renovated the basement into a community space, a place for the foundation's events, free after-school programs, and weekend workshops. My grandmother's kitchen became the heart of it all, just like before, with Dorothy refusing to fully retire, no matter how many times I tried to let her. The foundation. The Elizabeth and Harold Alexander Foundation for Education became the centerpiece of my work. We started with a $10 million endowment, focused on underprivileged students who needed more than just tuition. They needed tools, mentorship, and a network. We funded art programs in schools where the arts had been cut. We provided vocational training for students who didn't want college but still wanted skills to build a career. And we gave full scholarships to students who reminded me of myself at 17, full of potential but financially boxed in. One of the first recipients, Maria Vasquez, told me, "This changes everything, not just for me but for my younger siblings. Now they know it's possible." That moment made every sleepless night worth it. Business. Under Rosa's mentorship, I learned the basics of Alexander Logistics, not to take over, but to ensure the company stayed aligned with my grandparents' values. The profit-sharing program stayed. Employee benefits stayed. And when someone suggested we could cut costs by reducing driver safety training, the answer was an immediate no. Keeping those values intact wasn't just honoring my grandparents, it was proving that a business could thrive without stepping on people to get ahead. The boundaries. My biological family did try to reach out a few times, always when they needed something. My father hinted at a short-term loan to help with his company's cash flow. My mother suggested she could offer her expertise by joining the foundation's board. Jason, unsurprisingly, had another business idea. Each time, I referred them back to the terms I'd set: mutual respect, no financial manipulation, and honoring the will without question. Not one of them met those terms. It hurt at first, but over time, I realized I hadn't lost a family. I'd simply stopped mistaking DNA for loyalty. The new family. Sunday dinners didn't stop. They just looked different. We had Rosa and her husband, Carlos, and his wife, Dorothy, George, and sometimes even Chief Williams. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sundays with the same warmth my grandparents had created. This was the family I'd been given by choice, not by blood. And it turned out to be stronger, kinder, and more genuine than I'd ever imagined. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, one just like the day they died, I finally visited my grandparents' graves for the first time since the funeral. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the bench nearby, telling them about everything. The foundation, the scholarships, the business, the dinners. "I think I understand now," I told them quietly. It was never about the money. It was about what you could build with it. And I promise I'll keep building. A breeze stirred, scattering golden leaves around me. I took it as a sign, whether it was or not, that they approved. Looking forward. My life now isn't flashy. I still teach kindergarten. I still drive a practical car. I still prefer quiet weekends over crowded galas. The only difference is scale. When I see a problem I can help fix, I have the means to do it. I used to think $26 million was just a number on a page. Now I know it's not the number that matters. It's the impact it can make when it's in the right hands. And as long as I'm breathing, it will stay in the right hands. In the end, this wasn't a story about $26 million. It was a story about values, boundaries, and the courage to stand your ground when everyone around you is telling you to give in. My grandparents taught me that wealth isn't measured by the size of your bank account. It's measured by the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind. They lived that truth every day, quietly, without needing recognition. And when the moment came, they trusted me to carry it forward. I could have taken the easy way out, signed the papers, avoided the fight, kept a fraction of what they left. But easy paths rarely lead to the right destination. So I stood. And in standing, I didn't just protect their legacy. Built my own. If you ever find yourself in a moment like mine, when the choice is between keeping the peace or keeping your principles, choose the path that lets you look in the mirror tomorrow without regret. Because money can be stolen, houses can be sold, but self-respect, that's yours forever.